Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and it's time for part 2 of the Q&A, so let's go ahead and knock this out. Alright, first question. How to determine failure on exercises like non-chest supported rows? Now, some people would say, well, why does that even matter? Well, it matters because usually the last few reps, usually about 5 before we reach muscle failure, represents the threshold where we are hitting the highest threshold motor units and therefore the deepest muscle fibers. And once you pass failure, you're not hitting those anymore because they're no longer able to recruit. So you're back down to getting very little growth. This is one reason I tell people a lot of the forced reps and drop sets and rest pause may not produce any significant muscle growth. It's just making you tired. And it's fatiguing you, but it may not be causing any more muscle growth. And the data kind of leans in that direction. So with movements that are strict, that we're forced to do strict, it's very easy to tell when you hit failure. The weight stops moving. And, let's say we're even taking stuff like chest presses and whatever, bench press. When you have to grind really hard and the weight goes up real slow on a rep, it's grindy. And I'm probably not going to get the next rep if I try it. That's it. Because you're cheating a little bit, you're shifting a hair under the weight, it's grinding, going into a bad bar path. Okay? That's when we know those are at failure, or one rep away. Single joint exercises, when the weight stops moving, right? When you go to do a rep and the weight doesn't move out of the bottom, whether it's a curl or tricep extension, you go to do a rep and it just sticks. Okay, that's obviously failure. Same with machines. So how do we determine it on an exercise that you can cheat on and use body English? It's a little more tricky, isn't it? And I would say the same thing. We get into stuff like a push press, my God. It's almost impossible to tell, other than when you just miss a rep. But you're cheating more and more. So when you look at something like a row, I would say the point that you look at is, are you having to swing your body a little more to get the same reps? Now, keeping in mind, if you're slightly loose on the movement, it's more of a matter of, are you getting looser? If you're super strict, as soon as you're having to use any body English to move the weight, you reached muscle failure. Why? Because the muscles are no longer able to lift the weight. The primary movers, your lats, biceps, all of that, rear delts, traps, they're no longer able to move the weight anymore. You're having to use more and more leg drive and hip in order to get the weight started. It's basically making the weight lighter for you at that point. You reached muscle failure. Now, does that mean we should never do a loose rep? No. A lot of times when I'm programming these myself, I might technically have reached that point on rep 8 on a 10 rep set. I go ahead and do the last 9 and 10 reps. Why? Because it's usually easy to recover from an exercise like that, and it's just finishing out the set. But could we argue that we may not be getting any muscle growth in the primary movers? That might be the case. However, maybe some of the secondary movers might get a little bit out of it. So I usually personally like to finish up another rep or two, at least what my target reps I program for. But understand that most likely things like your lats or whatever are probably not getting extra growth from those last couple of reps where you're cheating. But at least you know that you reached muscle failure because you're being forced to cheat. Does that make sense? Because the form has broken down. At least one or two of the primary movers have reached muscle failure for that to occur. And that's pretty much on any multi-joint exercise, not just ones where we can swing on. It's just that the way that the form breaks down is different. For a bench press, the bar might drift way over your face. Okay? The squat, you might see way too much forward lean. Right? The bar path changes. So on a movement like this, we have to cheat. All right, next question. A short limb guy, great for squats and benching. However, deadlift just become very hard for me. What or how would you suggest I approach this issue? Well, we have to approach this issue from the perspective that if we have advantages and leverages in one lift, we're going to be bad at other things. In other words, if we have non-average ratios, if we're not perfectly average height, average arm, average leg length for our height, we're going to be better at some exercises and worse at others relative to other guys with a similar frame to us. Okay, we accept that. We know this. You accept that and get over it. And what you have to look at is say, okay, the deadlift is going to go harder for me. Be happy in the fact that you got a great bench. right? Be happy that your short arms give you a phenomenal bench press. And I've got lifters like that. I've got some lifters who train really hard, and we train their deadlifts amazingly well, who have shorter arms, and they're over here benching 340, but they're still sub 500 pullers. And I mean, they're training hard, and they're squatting over 400 too. Those shorter arms end up making it very, very difficult. Now, what do you do about it? You work harder at it. You accept the fact that you got a leverage disadvantage. And if you decide that the deadlift is really, really important to you, then you put in more work. And here's one of the things I'm going to say. If you're a short arm puller, and deadlifts are going to be very, very hard on you in certain ways, maybe you shouldn't be doing much rep work for the deadlifts. I would say in that case, don't beat yourself up putting your back into those deep, awkward angles all the time on pulling. Maybe use other hip hinges and rows and everything to build everything up. You need to overdevelop your weak links. You're going to have to specialize in the lift a little bit more if you really care about it, if it's a big deal to you. You may need to become a little bit of a deadlift specialist to get caught up. And essentially that means that you devote more of your time and recovery resources towards your weak links on the deadlift, right? Whether they're your middle back or your hamstrings or glutes. But I would say in general, no matter how bad your leverages are for the deadlift, you can always get better at it. You just have to thicken up all the primary movers, right? You need a bigger back. You need bigger glutes, bigger hamstrings, right? You're just going to have to focus on these things. And you're probably going to have to do a little more grip work as you're pulling the weight a longer distance. You're going to need to fine-tune your stances, figure out whether you're better conventional or sumo, okay? You're going to need to find your ideal leverages, your ideal stances and everything, because you're at a leverage disadvantage. Those things are going to become a lot more important for you. But hey, look at it on the bright side. You can bench. You can bench probably really well. I'm someone who's the opposite. Long arms. I struggle with the bench. I know that. I accept that, and I just have to work really, really, really hard. But conversely, you don't really see me doing a lot of deadlifting to have a big deadlift, right? I don't really have to. I just have to build the muscles for it. So again, just approach it from that perspective. But if it matters to you that much, you're going to have to specialize in it a bit. All right, next question and last question of the week. Can you compare and contrast the Pendlay row and the chest-supported row? How would you effectively implement both in training? Well, the thing to remember is that the Pendlay row involves posterior chain, and the chest-supported row does not. Like with anything else, you have to assess how much work do I need in a given area, and how much of my recovery is being used up by it. Okay, that's really all these are. These are training tools that. One of them is chest supported, so it removes the posterior chain. The other one has an isometric component to the posterior chain. If you're going through a phase where you're doing a lot of deadlifting, okay, even if you're doing some conjugate with a lot of speed pulls, right, and you're beating up your low back, let's say you're pushing your low back on a lot of movements and your glutes to their absolute limits, that might be the time when you want to program a little bit more chest supported rowing, right? Because you don't need that. But when you're going through periods of time to where you're doing very, very little deadlifting, you're doing very, very little work that's just beating that lower back up. Like let's say you're doing very little deadlifting, very little overhead pressing, stuff like that. Doing almost all Pendlay rows would probably behoove you. It'll carry over to your deadlift more because it's training you to use that isometric component at the start position of the deadlift. And you're not as worried about recovery in those areas depending upon what's going on with your exercise selection. Okay? It's just a matter of balancing these things out. But realistically, that is the primary difference between the two. And it's just a matter of, like with every other muscle through the body, avoiding overuse and getting the exercises that work what you need them to work in the total weekly volumes that you need them to work it in. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.